Arnie, who's taken the trouble to come and hear about the research that I would like to share with the MND Queensland community today. So my name is Brooke-Mai Whelan, and as the slide indicates, I am a speech pathologist working at the University of Queensland as both a teacher of undergraduate speech pathology students, but also an academic researcher. And my area of interest, and where I have very gratefully received funding from Motor Neurone Disease Research Australia this year, is to gain a better understanding of the speech decline that we see in MND, and to look at how, if patients with MND respond to different kinds of behavioural speech treatments to preserve natural speech within the MND population. So before I formally start my discussion of the research project, I would like to acknowledge country. The University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, and we recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So let's have a bit of a discussion about speech deterioration or speech change in MND. We know that when we look at lived experience research where people with MND and their family members or caregivers are interviewed or surveyed, that speech deterioration or speech change is considered to be one of the most overwhelming aspects of the disease. And this comes before the loss of mobility, swallowing difficulties, and this sort of negative long-term prognosis for people that are diagnosed with the condition. And as a speech pathologist, this weighs very heavily on my mind. Also, given the fact that we are asked very commonly the following two questions by people with MND, and they are, will I lose my speech following this diagnosis? How long is it going to take for me to lose my speech? And most importantly, can you stop me from losing my speech? And unfortunately, right at this minute, we really can't answer this question accurately for individuals with MND. We've got some very sort of broad scoping research that indicates, especially in people with bulbar type MND, that there will be definitely speech changes over time. But there is a lot of variation from person to person in terms of how quickly that deterioration will take place, if they're going to require alternative and augmentative communication systems. And also there's really no active interventions in the research at the moment that indicate we can stop people from losing their speech, which is why I'm particularly interested in this area of research. So if we look a little bit about the speech condition in MND, it is called dysarthria. I'm sure most people are familiar with that term, and it basically refers to the changes in the way that speech sounds over the course of disease progression. We know that there are clearly two different types of motor neurone disease. So we've got a group that are diagnosed as bulbar onset, where they present with bulbar symptoms as those first signs of disease, which often include speech change or swallowing change. And then we have the other group of people that will have spinal onset, so sort of more limb affectation as opposed to those bulbar symptoms. Importantly, for this bulbar group of patients, there are marked implications for speech function. This is the subtype of MND that is most associated with changes in speech function. And research indicates that the incidence of dysarthria is really high in this group. So as high as 93% of people with bulbar onset disease will be diagnosed with dysarthria over the course of their disease. But the patients with spinal onset disease will also most likely develop dysarthria over time. Again, the research indicates that about 80% of people that are diagnosed with spinal onset disease may develop dysarthria throughout the disease course. The kind of dysarthria that we see is usually diagnosed as a mixed dysarthria, and that's because different motor neurone systems are affected within the brain in people with MND, commonly the upper motor neuron system as well as the lower motor neuron system. And that impacts the kinds of speech symptoms that we see in people with MND. As a group of, or as a population or a group of people with a specific kind of dysarthria, the symptoms that speech pathologists commonly observe and assess are a reduction in the rate of speech over time. Articulatory precision becomes less, so your speech might sound slurred or slushy or not as precise when you're speaking. You may also notice changes in the level of nasality in your speech. So sometimes the soft palate will become weak as a result of disease progression, and your speech might sound more nasal, sort of like you're speaking through your nose. And then in other people, you might also see changes in vocal quality. So things like a reduction in the loudness of your voice, a reduction in the power and stamina of your voice. You might sort of feel like your voice gets very tired after speaking for certain periods of time. And you might notice changes in the quality of your voice. So your voice might become husky or hoarse, or the pitch might lower or increase. Different kinds of vocal changes can also be common in MND. And all of these sort of features combined can impact how effective your verbal communication is to the partners that communicate with you in real world situations. So as a speech pathologist, my real interest is in looking at the nature of speech decline in MND. How quickly does it decline? What does the decline involve? What subsystems of speech production are involved? We know that there are, in the current literature, a limited number of studies which have examined how speech changes in MND. But what we do know from those limited studies is that in people with this bulbar onset disease, the way their speech change is really characterized by this slower speaking rate. So over time, the rate of speech becomes very slow, and that then sort of coincides with a reduction in what we call intelligibility. Intelligibility means how easily am I able to be understood by the people that I'm communicating to. So if someone's got a low level of intelligibility, it means that when I'm talking, the people that are listening to me are having a hard time understanding what I'm saying. We know that these changes in speaking rate, this slowness of rate, slowing down of speech, happens before we see this decline in intelligibility or how well people are able to be understood. And this decline in intelligibility occurs when the speaking rate of people with MND drops to less than or equal to around about 120 words per minute. So as speech pathologists, we'll often put you through these assessment processes that allow us to look at where your speech rate is, because that's giving us an idea of perhaps when your speech is going to become less intelligible. As a rule of thumb, speech is predicted to remain functional for around about 18 months following the first sign of a bulbar symptom in people with this bulbar onset type of disease. But as I've said, this trajectory or this profile or pattern of disease can vary quite widely from person to person. So that doesn't mean that everybody will follow that pattern of change over time. And we do know, interestingly, that speech decline is certainly not affected by gender or age in the MND community or MND population. So the scope of work for speech pathologists in MND really is as follows. At the moment, our role in working and supporting patients with MND is to maintain the ability to eat for as long as possible and maintain the ability to engage in intelligible communication or intelligible speech for as long as possible, to minimise the risk of aspiration. So you know that often as your laryngeal or sort of your vocal folds may become weak and the muscles of swallowing become weak, it is possible that you can swallow food and fluid down the wrong way. So instead of it going down into the esophagus, into the food pipe, it can go down the windpipe and into the lungs, and we call that aspiration. And that is not a condition that is you know, a positive one. It can certainly cause major health implications. So the role of the speech pathologist is to minimise that risk by modifying a patient's diet. For example, thickened fluids can eradicate aspiration in some people. We are also heavily involved in managing sialorrhea, so that thick mucus production in the mouth that can be such a frustrating and difficult symptom to deal with. And also we are very much involved in education and counselling about the communication and swallowing eating changes that may be encountered or experienced throughout disease progression. Unfortunately, at this point in time, best practice guidelines don't provide recommendations for speech pathologists to actively manage the dysarthria in motor neuron disease. So in other neurological conditions, for example, we may undertake regular therapy sessions with patients to improve perhaps the strength of their speech musculature, to improve the intelligibility of their speech. At this point in time, practice guidelines do not endorse that kind of active management for dysarthria in motor neuron disease. What we are involved in is this assessment and ongoing monitoring of communication needs and abilities of people with MND. We are very much involved in making sure that AAC equipment and relevant devices is provided in a timely fashion so that people are given a means of communication as quickly as possible once their natural speech is perhaps no longer a viable way of communicating. And we also review the ability of people to use those AAC devices over time. We're also involved in working with other healthcare professionals that support the use of AAC systems for people with MND, like occupational therapists, for example, and physiotherapists. And we provide ongoing support and training for people with MND and their family members or caregivers in terms of using their AAC equipment or perhaps using communication strategies to enhance how understandable their speech is. We know that even though AAC plays a very important role in maintaining the ability to communicate in MND, that not everybody wants to utilise this as a form of communication, that uptake of AAC devices is not always optimal in the MND community. And this is because when we investigate why people with MND don't particularly like AAC through this lived experience research, they make comments like what are on this slide. I like it very much, as in they like the AAC device very much. But as I said to my speech and language therapist, it's a nice toy, but it's like admitting defeat to not use my own voice. And another comment is that I try to talk to her, so this is from a caregiver's perspective, because she'd rather say it rather than write it down or use the light writer, which is kind of like a text output device, with me, that is, as I've done for many years. So we know that for people with MND, it's a really major goal to preserve effective communication for as long as possible, and that the ability to communicate in natural way with our natural speech is critical for people with MND to maintain quality of life. And we know also from this study that even when people with MND, their speech may not be intelligible or deemed to be intelligible or understandable by their communication partners, they would still prefer to use natural speech than an AAC device. So trying to find ways to preserve speech is a high priority. We know now, especially in sort of the last 5 to 10 years, that voice banking is really taking off in the MND community, whereby we bank somebody's speech or voice before the deterioration of their speech. But just like with AAC devices, not everybody with MND elects to voice bank. So this study that was conducted in 2020 showed that 75% of their participants elected to voice bank, and that the people that chose to voice bank said that the reason they were doing it is that by preserving their voice, really for them, they felt was preserving their identity over time. They would have access to what their voice sounded like embedded within a future AAC device. But 25% of the study elected not to bank their voice. So they didn't see that this was a viable option for communication moving forward, because their belief was that you could not replicate their natural voice or preserve their identity with a banked voice. So some people appreciate it, like it, use it, others don't. So looking at what is or what has been done in the past to treat or rehabilitate, if you like, or preserve the speech of people with MND, historical findings that have looked at using these active exercises or interventions for people with motor neuron disease are really limited. So when I've reviewed the literature, and I've just completed a scoping review of all of the literature over about the last 40 years, there were two studies, one conducted in 1979 and one conducted in 2001. On a very small number of participants. So each of these studies looked at sort of single case studies, single people, and they showed negative outcomes. So when we applied speech treatment to these cases with MND, their speech actually got worse at the end of treatment. And it is those studies that have really guided and directed this belief that active speech is contraindicated or damaging in people with MND. But a more recent review of the literature, so last year, there were two studies that demonstrated a positive impact on speech outcomes in people with MND. So there was one study that came out of Russia that looked at a music therapy program that went for 6 weeks, that provided 2 sessions of treatment a week for around about 1 hour of time for each session. And it focused on different speech production systems. So they did breathing exercises, which focus on that respiratory system, phonatory exercises, which look at the voice and that voicing system and how the voice sounds and the power of the voice, and a resonance focus, which looks at all those structures above the level of the larynx, so the tongue and the lips. What kinds of exercises can we do to promote the better functioning of those particular anatomical structures? And they had some positive outcomes on speech performance. The other study that was conducted in 2022 involved 5 weeks of treatment, 5 sessions in total that were 45 minutes each, so 1 session per week. Again, they very much focused on the different speech subsystems, so looking at the respiratory system, the phonatory system, the larynx, the resonance system, and then prosody. So sort of how our voice sounds, those intonational patterns, the rise and fall of pitch as we talk, which is so important in human voicing. And that too demonstrated some positive outcomes in speech performance within the MND population. We also know from other studies, which include animal studies and studies that have looked at limb function in people with MND, that actually our previous idea that exercise in MND was damaging may not be accurate. So there is other research out there now that says that mild to moderate level exercise can actually be beneficial to preserve motor function in MND. And some examples are listed here on the slide. So one study in 2018 conducted a randomized controlled trial, so where they separated a group of people with MND into 2 groups. One was an active treatment group and one was a sham treatment group, so like a placebo group. And they used expiratory muscle strength training as the exercise. So that's using a tool that people blow into against resistance with the aim of improving respiratory function. So one group had a tool that actually provided resistance, and the other group, the sham group, used a tool that looked the same but didn't provide any resistance. And what that study showed was that there was definitely an increase in respiratory function that was measured by a maximum expiratory pressure, and interestingly, swallowing efficiency and global swallowing function. So this exercise program had impacts on respiratory function as well as swallowing function, positive impacts over time. Then there's another study that was conducted in 2021, again, a randomized control study, so where patients were separated into different groups and they looked at aerobic exercise, strength exercises and flexibility training in one group compared to a group that just engaged in very sort of passive home-based stretching exercises. And what they found was that there were better outcomes in respiratory function and mobility and well-being in that program of exercise that combined aerobic exercise, strength and flexibility training. So what this preliminary research indicates is that exercise may actually be beneficial for people with motor neurone disease. And certainly as a speech pathologist working in the area of neurodegenerative disease, we do work very actively with other populations to maintain and preserve speech function through regular exercise. And one example is the LSVT Loud program, which was specifically designed and has been researched to the hilt in people with Parkinson's disease. Now, I'm not saying that this particular therapy is appropriate for people with MND, but what I am saying is that neurodegenerative disease, a diagnosis of neurodegenerative disease, does not necessarily mean that you are not an appropriate candidate for active rehabilitation, because it does work in other disease subtypes. So that brings me to my research, which is entitled the Save Our Speech Study, the SOS study. And the aim of this research is to really better understand speech changes in MND. So this is the first phase of this research. And the way that I'm going to do this is to monitor the speech of people with MND over time and to analyse it and then identify speech markers of disease progression and speech decline and how those changes in speech relate to patient-reported indicators of functional communication loss. And I'll also be identifying what speech fatigue looks like in MND and how stable and variable the speech of people with MND is over time. So a little bit about the study. I am actively recruiting participants for this study at the moment and would be very appreciative of anyone that might like to contact me with interest in participating. Giving you a little bit of detail now about what's involved in the study. So it involves online speech sample collection. So just like I'm talking to you this morning via Teams, we use a different platform to Teams, but it's essentially the same kind of interaction where a speech pathologist talks to you online and records through this platform speech samples while you're engaged in different speech tasks. So you don't need to leave your home, but we do monitor you over a fairly extended period of time. So that's around 8 months we will monitor you for, and we will capture data at least twice each month. So it involves around about 27 online data collections in an 8-month period, with an average session time of between about 45 minutes to an hour. So as I've said, all the sessions are conducted online from the comfort of your own home, under the direction of a speech pathologist. During the sessions, there is nothing difficult. You're just asked to complete a number of speech tasks and to answer questions in relation to how effective you feel your speech is at that current time. And the speech samples will be recorded and stored securely for analysis during each of those sessions. So what might be in it for you as a participant? Well, the study itself, this phase 1 study, is purely observational. So it's not a treatment study. It's just observing possible speech changes in participants over an 8-month period. There are no direct benefits for you in relation to speech function in this particular study because we're simply observing the pattern of change over time. But what this information will do is to provide really important insights for researchers into the rate and pattern of speech change that contributes to what we call functional communication loss in MND. So what these changes are that we're hearing, how do those changes affect how well I'm able to be understood by people around me? Not just familiar communication partners, but also when I'm trying to communicate out in the real world, how is my communication going? And it will provide a really important step towards developing more objective measurement tools. So these are things that are, so speech pathology tools can be quite subjective. It's all about what the speech pathologist's ear is hearing. But we want to develop more objective measurement tools that allow us to even potentially diagnose MND from speech samples. They're going to allow us to monitor disease progression over time, and also to look at how people respond to speech treatment. So that's behavioural treatment, like those exercises that we talked about, but it could also be used to look at how different drug therapies may be impacting speech function as well. So if you're interested in participating, these are the volunteer requirements or the inclusion criteria. Obviously, an adult with a diagnosis of motor neurone disease is required. You would need to have adequate memory and attentional skills to participate in online data collection tasks, because obviously anyone that's online, you're able to utilise these online platforms easily, but you would need to be able to navigate those systems quite well independently if you were keen to participate. For this study, it is absolutely appropriate for you to have some speech change that's associated with MND, or you may not have any speech change at this point in time. Either of those situations is appropriate. However, we need for you to still be using your natural speech as your primary means of communication, because we want to look at natural speech change over time. So if anyone is 100% reliant on AAC systems at this stage in this study, unfortunately, you would not be able to participate. The other conditions of inclusion are that you live in Queensland. So at the moment, we are ethically cleared to recruit participants through the MND clinics at the Royal Brisbane Hospital, as well as the Prince Charles Hospital. But also anyone that's affiliated with MND Queensland, as is the group of people that I'm talking to today, or people that are affiliated with MND and me. So if you attend those MND clinics online or in person, or if you're a part of these associations, you are certainly eligible to be included in this study if you fit the other inclusion criteria. And also to have obviously basic computer skills, you would need access to an electronic device, so a PC, a personal computer, or an iPad. You would need an email address and internet service that's pretty reliable, because we're conducting the sessions online. You would need to have a fairly stable internet connection in order for us to capture the data that is needed. So that is really all the information that I was wanting to share with you this morning, and I very much appreciate your time and interest, and thank you and Simone for the opportunity to come and speak with you today about the research. If you are interested in participating, please feel free to contact me directly. So my email address is listed here on the slide. It is bmw@uq.edu.au, and my phone number is also listed there if you would like to talk about the research in more detail. If no one is able to take those details down now but is still keen to participate, I know that Simone is happy to pass your details on to me if you let her know that you're interested in participating. So I will stop sharing my screen, and I will now...
Excuse me, Brooke-Mai, before you stop sharing your screen, the last screen or slide we can see is about voice banking. So the slide about with your contact details is not...
Didn't it come up?
No, we've met like a few of your slides that you were talking to. We haven't been able to see. The last slide we can see is about voice banking. So I just thought it'd be important to share your details in a visual
sorry,
format.
Simone, that's very strange because on my end it is progressing nicely. Let me just move along. And I can send you through the slides if you would like. Can you see my contact details now?
No, I can't. Artie, what about you? No.
No, that is really strange because I can see them on my screen.
I can see the contact screen.
Oh.
Oh, good,
Okay.
Arnie, good.
Thank you.
Good.
I did see a screen on voice banking.
Did you see the slides as I was talking through, Arnie?
Yep, it seemed good to me.
Oh, great. I'm so pleased that you were able to see that. So thank you so much, Dr. Brooke-Mai. I have actually learnt so much just hearing you talk about motor neuron disease, but then also the different studies that have gone before. And I'm excited about learning more about the decline in speech and what treatments it could possibly lead to. I'm just going to pause for a moment. Arnie, do you have any questions or comments you would like to?
No,
share?
not really. I just found that very interesting. My MND started in my lower body, like my legs, and it seems to be working its way up. It hasn't affected my swallowing, but I've just noticed that my voice has changed a bit.
Yeah.
Elaine says it's a bit husky. I thought it was quiet.
And sometimes the two can go together, Arnie, that you can get sort of husky and quiet at the same time. So it's a combination of things. But yes, it's a common finding in MND that you can have voice changes over time. And if you're keen to participate in the study, we'd be very keen to have you. So let me know if you have time to think about it, and if you're keen, we'd be really keen to have you on board.
Well, I thought it would probably be a good idea. Give me something to do.
Oh, we'd love to have you. So if you